The B-17 carried 13.5 caliber machine guns, nose, tail, waist, ball turret, top turret, overlapping fields of fire in every direction. On paper, a formation of these bombers was a flying fortress in the truest sense, self-escorting, self-defending, no fighter cover required. That was the doctrine, written down, taught, and believed. By the autumn of 1943, the average B-17 over Germany survived 11 missions before it was shot down, written off, or its crew was dead or captured. 11 out of a required tour of 25. The guns worked, the gunners were brave, the formations flew exactly as trained. None of it mattered. The bombers kept dying at a rate the Army Air Forces had calculated would be acceptable, and then kept flying the same missions after the calculation was proven wrong. The idea was born in the 1930s at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama. A small group of officers concluded that a modern industrial nation could be defeated by destroying the specific factories that supplied its war machine: ball bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft assembly lines. Precision, not area bombing. Daylight, so bombardiers could actually see the target through the new Norden bomb sight. The problem was getting there. Fighter aircraft of the era didn't have the fuel range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and back. The tactical school's answer was to make the bomber capable of defending itself, hence the 13 guns, the tight defensive formations, the name Flying Fortress. In August 1942, the 8th Air Force flew its first mission from England, 12 B-17s against a rail yard in Rouen, France. Light targets, short range, fighter cover the whole way. The early results looked promising enough to commit to the doctrine at scale. By 1943, the targets moved deeper. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, aircraft plants at Regensburg. These were past the range of any escort fighter in the Allied inventory. The doctrine said that didn't matter. The guns would hold. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s launched against both targets in a single coordinated strike, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that point. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17s out of 230, a 15.6% loss rate. The Regensburg force lost 24 out of 146, around 600 airmen gone in one afternoon. The doctrine had just been tested. It had failed. The mission was called a success anyway.
To understand what went wrong, start with what a defensive formation is actually supposed to do. In theory, a combat box, 18 to 21 bombers stacked in a staggered three-dimensional formation, creates an overlapping cone of machine gun fire. A fighter approaching from any angle flies into the guns of multiple aircraft at once. The math said this should make a formation survivable, even without escort. Concentrated firepower, mutual protection, no gaps. Remove the escort fighters from that equation, and the formation has to do everything the escorts would have done and everything it was designed to do at the same time, for hours, over hostile territory. That's the part the math didn't model well. A .50 caliber machine gun fired from a bouncing, vibrating bomber at 25,000 feet against a fighter closing at over 300 miles per hour on a head-on pass that lasted maybe 2 seconds required a level of deflection shooting that almost no gunner, however well trained, could reliably achieve. The guns weren't useless, but they were nowhere near as effective as the formation theory assumed. Fighter pilots who flew against B-17 formations in 1943 described head-on attacks, specifically because the nose guns were the weakest point. Fewer guns, worst angles, least time to track. Then there was the airframe itself. The B-17's fuselage skin was thin aluminum, designed to save weight for range and bomb load. It stopped rifle-caliber rounds and shrapnel reasonably well. It did almost nothing against a 20mm cannon shell, which the German Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s carried in increasing numbers through 1943. One account from the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid described a B-17 struck by cannon fire and cut in two. It appeared to happen in slow motion, the forward and rear fuselage separating and tumbling down independently. No one in either section survived. And then there was fuel range, the original problem the entire doctrine was built to solve, and never actually did. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter in 1943, could escort bombers part way into Germany and then had to turn back. The exact moment the escort peeled away, the moment German controllers were watching for, was the moment the bombers crossed into the most heavily defended airspace in the world, alone. The formation theory had one structural flaw baked in from the start. It assumed the fighters would be a backup. It was built to be the entire plan. By the time the bombers reached Schweinfurt or Regensburg, three things were happening simultaneously. German fighters were making coordinated head-on passes against the weakest part of the formation. Flak batteries, entirely unaffected by formation tactics, were firing into a predictable box of aircraft holding a fixed course at a fixed altitude for bombing accuracy. And the bombers, carrying full bomb loads and partially expended fuel, were at their heaviest and least maneuverable point of the entire mission. The Flying Fortress was never tested as a fortress. It was tested as the only line of defense it was never supposed to be. That was the design problem. What happened next was a command problem, and command had the data showing the design problem 6 weeks before they sent the bombers back to Schweinfurt anyway. Subscribe if you want more of these. Here's what command did with that data.
After the August 17th raid, the loss rate, over 15% on the Schweinfurt force alone, was not a secret. It was briefed up the chain. 8th Air Force planners knew that a sustained loss rate anywhere near that figure would destroy the command's combat strength within a handful of missions. If every mission cost 15% of the force, the 8th Air Force would be destroyed in 7 missions. The response was not to change the doctrine. The response was to wait, rebuild strength, and try again, at the same target, the same way, deeper into the same defended airspace with the same absence of escort. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17s were sent back to Schweinfurt. The mission would later be remembered by its date, Black Thursday. Of the 291 attacking fortresses, 60 were shot down over Germany, 5 crashed on approach to Britain, and 12 more were scrapped due to damage, a total loss of 77 B-17s. Losses in aircrew were equally severe, with 650 men lost of 2,900, 22% of the bomber crews. A single afternoon's mission cost the 8th Air Force more men than most infantry regiments lose in a month of ground combat. The institutional failure here was not a single bad decision. It was the gap between what the data said and what the doctrine demanded, and the choice, repeated, to keep flying the doctrine while the data piled up underneath it. The tactical school's theory had been built in a classroom in Alabama in the 1930s. By October 1943, it had a body count attached to it that ran into the thousands, and it was still the plan. The crews flying these missions were not told the formation theory was unproven. They were told it worked, that the guns would hold, that the math was sound. Men who survived their first Schweinfurt run and were rotated back for the second one in October were flying into a mission their own command's records already showed was unsustainable. 11 missions. That was the number. Not a rumor among the crews, a statistic the command itself could have produced, because the command was the one counting the losses. The fix, when it came, didn't come from a new bomber, a new gun, or a revised formation manual. It came from a fighter. The P-51 Mustang entered service with the 8th Air Force in late 1943 and early 1944, carrying enough internal fuel, later extended further with drop tanks, to escort B-17s all the way to the target and back. In February 1944, during the week Allied planners called Big Week, over 1,000 B-17s and B-24s struck the German aircraft industry with fighter cover the entire way. The Luftwaffe, forced to fight Mustangs over its own airfields for the first time, began to be ground down in a way it never fully recovered from. The bombers hadn't changed. The guns hadn't changed. The formations were the same formations that had been shredded over Schweinfurt 5 months earlier. What changed was that the thing the doctrine had assumed away, fighter escort, was finally there. Here's what the B-17 story actually is. It isn't a story about a flawed airplane. The airframe survived damage that should have been fatal again and again and brought crews home on 3 engines and 800 holes. The B-17 did everything that could reasonably be asked of an aircraft. What it is a story about is a doctrine that was wrong, evidence that proved it was wrong, and an institution that kept sending men to test a theory that had already failed, because changing the plan was harder than explaining why it wasn't working. The B-17s that flew Black Thursday and Big Week are largely gone now, scrapped after the war, a handful preserved in museums, fewer still flying at airshows, engines turning over for crowds who mostly come to see the shape of the thing. The shape was never the problem. If you want the next one, the torpedo crews who flew with weapons their own Navy refused to admit were defective, subscribe. That story starts underwater.